Turn the clock back more than 2,000 years. Imagine placing a bolt of silk, fresh from the loom, just outside the gates of Chang'an. We immediately face a question that sounds simple but is surprisingly difficult to answer. How could it possibly reach the distant Mediterranean? Who would carry it there? Would a Han Chinese merchant walk all the way from Chang'an to Rome? Would a Roman caravan cross the Pamirs and then the Taklamakan Desert? Or would some legendary traveler make the entire transcontinental journey alone? The real answer is precisely what makes the Silk Road so fascinating. Most of the time, no single person traveled the whole way. A bolt of silk might first be bought by a merchant in Chang'an and carried into the Heshi corridor. At Dunhuang, it might pass to another caravan. In the Darien Basin, it could be sold again to local traders. After crossing the Pamirs, it might enter a Sogdian commercial network. Farther west, it could move through Bactria, the Iranian plateau, or Mesopotamia before finally reaching the eastern Mediterranean. Along the way, it might be repackaged, repriced, cut apart, dyed, or embroidered with new patterns. The people carrying it spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and used different currencies. Many of them may never even have heard the name Silk Road. In fact, ancient people did not call these routes the Silk Road at all. The name so familiar to us today only became widely used in the 19th century. What ancient travelers faced was not a straight line drawn from Chang'an to Rome, but a constantly shifting web of routes. Some ran overland, others by sea. There were camel trails across deserts, horse routes across the steppe, high mountain passages over the Pamirs, and maritime routes across the Indian Ocean timed to the monsoon winds. Some roads vanished during wars. Others rose with new cities, new empires, and new markets. What truly connected Eurasia was never one lonely road. It was a network created step by countless people traveling for survival, trade, faith, knowledge, and adventure. Tonight, we're going to follow that network slowly, one stretch at a time. There's no need to memorize every date or every city. We only need to keep one question in mind. How could an object, a story, or a belief cross thousands of kilometers and move from one civilization into another? Once we understand that, we will also understand how the Silk Road endured for more than 1,000 years, and why, in the end, it never truly disappeared. Long before Zhang Qian set out, people were already moving and exchanging goods across Eurasia. Communities living on the steppe and around oasis regions have followed river valleys, mountain passes, and grasslands for centuries. Jade, metals, horses, woolen textiles, plant seeds, and ornaments often traveled farther than the borders of empires. Archaeological sites in Xinjiang and Central Asia show that long before the Silk Road was supposedly opened, people and goods were already moving among the Darien Basin, the Heshi corridor, the Central Asian steppe, and regions farther west. The Silk Road was not a highway suddenly built on a single day. It was a much older collection of paths that, under particular historical conditions, gradually became part of a much larger network. The person who first gave an East Asian dynasty a systematic picture of Central Asia was a man later immortalized in the historical record, Zhang Qian. In the 2nd century BCE, the Han dynasty faced sustained pressure from the Xiongnu along its northern frontier. Emperor Wu of Han wanted allies who could help contain them. So he turned his attention to a people who had been defeated by the Xiongnu and driven westward, the Yuezhi. Around 138 BCE, Zhang Qian left Han-controlled territory with an embassy of more than 100 people. His mission was not commercial. It was diplomatic. Find the Yuezhi and persuade them to cooperate with the Han. The plan went wrong almost immediately. Not long after Zhang Qian's party entered territory controlled by the Xiongnu, they were detained. He was not killed, but he remained among the Xiongnu for many years. Eventually, he found an opportunity to escape. The safest choice would have been to head east, back toward Han territory. He did not. He kept going west. That decision transformed a failed diplomatic mission into a journey that changed how an empire understood the world. Zhang Qian traveled through Central Asia and gathered information about Dian, Quanzhou, the Eurasian, and lands even farther away. He discovered that the places the Han court might have imagined as the edge of the world still contained cities, farms, markets, and roads leading farther west. The Fergana Valley was famous for its horses. Central Asian oases grew grapes and alfalfa. Beyond them lay Anxi, the Parthian Empire. For the Han court, this information was worth far more than a simple map. It proved that west of the Xiongnu lay an enormous and complex world, and that world was not beyond reach. Zhang Qian finally returned to the Han around 126 BCE. Of the more than 100 people who had set out with him, only a few remained. His diplomatic objective had not been fully achieved. The Yuezhi did not renew their war against the Xiongnu as the Han had hoped. But the intelligence he brought back transformed the dynasty's understanding of the West. Sima Qian later recorded the journey in the records of the Grand Historian. Later generations often described Zhang Qian's achievement with the phrase, opening the way, as though he had pierced a hole through a wall that had once been sealed shut. But this is where we need to slow down for a moment. Zhang Qian did not invent the Silk Road, and he certainly did not build a road running directly from Chang'an to Rome. What he really did was bring a collection of older, disconnected routes into the political awareness of the Han court in a much more systematic way. Afterward, the Han established commanderies and military outposts in the Hushi corridor and steadily strengthened its ability to control and operate in the western regions. The growing movement of envoys, soldiers, merchants, and transport caravans made formerly fragmented routes more stable and made it easier for commodities such as silk to keep moving west. Heading west from Chang'an, the first great corridor was the Hushi corridor. On a map, it looks like a long, narrow strip squeezed between mountains and desert. The Chilean mountains rise to the south. Deserts and rugged highlands stretch to the north. Meltwater from snow-capped peaks feeds rivers that create one oasis after another in an otherwise arid landscape. Wuwei, Zhangye, Zhuqiuan, Dunhuang, names that would later become famous, grew as nodes along these precious water sources. To an ancient traveler, a city meant something very different from what it means to us today. When we look at a city, we may first think of landmarks, population, or architecture. When a caravan saw an oasis town, it thought first of one thing: water. Water meant the camels could drink. It meant water skins could be refilled. It meant people might eat something hot. It meant an injured animal could rest. It meant the next stretch of desert might actually be survivable. An oasis that looked small on a map could mean the difference between life and death on a long-distance journey. That is why Dunhuang became so important. It stood near the junction of the main routes leading into the Darien Basin. Beyond it, travelers faced fewer water sources, stronger winds, heavier sand, and longer stretches of empty country. Here, a caravan had to inspect its pack gear, replenish food, hire guides who knew the terrain, and ask about the weather and security conditions ahead. Experienced merchants did not simply ask, which road is shortest? They asked, which well still has water? Where have there been robberies lately? Which city-state has changed rulers? which mountain pass is already snowed in. In the ancient world, information itself was a commodity. A reliable piece of news could sometimes be worth more than a bag of silver. After leaving Dunhuang, travelers did not simply cross straight through the middle of the Taklamakan Desert. The main routes usually followed oases around the edge of the basin. The northern route ran along the southern foothills of the Tian Shan, passing a chain of oasis settlements. The southern route followed the northern edge of the Kunlun Mountains. Today, we could draw these routes on a map with ease. For ancient travelers, however, a road was never a fixed line. Rivers changed course. Oases declined. Wars broke out. Cities rose and vanished. Any of these could change the best route. Lulan is a reminder of exactly that. Located near Lop Nur, Lulan was one of the important nodes of the early Silk Road. Its position repeatedly drew it into competition among larger powers, while its survival depended on a fragile water system. As environmental conditions and water sources changed, the city's importance gradually declined until it was eventually swallowed by sand. Archaeology later brought Lulan back into the modern imagination. But what makes the city truly compelling is not simply the phrase "lost city." It teaches us something more fundamental. Prosperity on the Silk Road was never permanent. Without water, even the greatest trade route will go around you. Without security, even the busiest market will fall silent. Before we continue west, let us stop for a moment and look at how the bolt of silk from the beginning of our story was actually made. Silk is easy to romanticize because by the time it appears on an aristocrat's clothing, all we see is sheen and softness. But its real beginning was not a palace. It was a mulberry leaf. In spring, mulberry trees put out new leaves. Silkworm farmers had to harvest them constantly because the worm's appetite grew rapidly as they matured. The room had to be kept at the right temperature and dryness. The rearing trays had to stay clean, and the leaves could not be too wet. When silkworms eat mulberry leaves, they make a faint, dense, rustling sound. With enough of them in one room, it can sound like a light rain falling indoors. A few weeks later, the silkworms begin spinning cocoons. A cocoon does not look especially impressive, but turning it into usable thread requires skill. The cocoons must be processed, the filament ends found, and several delicate strands reeled together into raw silk strong enough to use. Only then come dyeing, weaving, and finishing. Elaborate brocades require more advanced looms and highly skilled artisans. Behind a single beautiful bolt of silk lies an enormous amount of invisible labor. That helps explain why silk was so expensive. Its value did not come from some mysterious foreign fascination with the East. It came from the time, technical skill, and human labor required to produce it. Once silk entered long-distance trade, transportation risk was added to the price as well. Imagine a bolt of brocade leaving the workshop and arriving at the market. The first buyer would not ask whether it could make it to Rome. He cared about two things: quality and price. If the pattern was flawed, the price fell. If routes through the western regions had recently become unsafe, merchants might push down the purchase price. If nobles in some distant market suddenly favored a particular color, demand could rise. Historical trade never followed a fixed formula. There was no rule that silk automatically doubled in price every 1,000 li it traveled from Chang'an. Markets were always changing. The real skill of a clever merchant was learning about those changes before everyone else. That is where commercial information moving through and around Chang'an became valuable. A traveler from a hushy corridor might report which stretches of road were open. Someone returning from the western regions might say that one city was short of silk this year, but had many horses for sale. Another merchant might hear that a certain type of West Asian glassware had suddenly become fashionable among Chinese aristocrats and decide to risk buying up a large stock. And so, the bolt of silk from the beginning of our story is purchased, is folded, wrapped, and bundled together with other cargo. Once it is loaded onto a camel, the packaging must survive dust, abrasion, and sudden rain. A caravan would not casually place its most valuable goods on the outside, nor would it load all its highest value cargo onto a single animal. Ancient merchants understood diversification of risk too. If one camel slipped into a ravine, at least it would not take the entire fortune with it. The morning a caravan set out was not especially dramatic. There was no music. No one stood outside the city gate applauding. More often, there was simply a group of sleepy people checking knots. A camel handler patted an animal on the neck and made it kneel to be loaded. Someone checked the water skins one last time. Someone else stuffed dry rations into a bag. The caravan leader and the guide quietly discussed how far they hoped to travel that day. The hardest thing to manage was not the cargo. It was the animals. Camels can endure drought, but they can still get sick. If packed gear rubbed through the skin, the wound could become infected. If a load was badly balanced, problems might appear after only a few dozen kilometers. A long-distance caravan had to know how to read a camel's behavior, appetite, and feet. Sometimes an experienced camel handler was more valuable than a merchant who was good with numbers. While the morning was still cool, the caravan tried to cover as much ground as possible. Camels do not move quickly. Seen from a distance, a caravan could even look boring. The lead animal takes a step. The next follows. Bells ring in a steady rhythm. For hours, the landscape barely changes. In a place like this, it is easy to lose any real sense of distance. Most of long-distance travel was not drama. It was repetition. Walk, stop, drink, check the cargo, walk again. By afternoon, the wind might rise until blowing sand turned the entire world yellow. Travelers wrapped cloth around their mouths and noses and kept their heads down. This was when inexperienced people were most likely to panic because suddenly they could no longer see the front or back of the caravan. The group would try to keep the animals tightly together so no one fell behind. The deadliest danger was not always a gigantic sandstorm. Sometimes it was simply one person walking a few dozen steps in the wrong direction. He sees a shadow ahead and thinks it is the caravan. He follows it, only to discover that it is nothing but a dune. By the time the wind eases, he can no longer hear the bells. That is why guides mattered. An experienced guide did not know a road. He knew details. Which rock looked like a camel? Which ridge turned purple at sunset? Which salt flat must never be crossed? Which well appeared to hold water, but had become too bitter to drink? And when there were no clear landmarks at night, the stars could become another source of direction. But ancient navigation was never as simple or as romantic as following the North Star. The night sky changes with latitude, and cloud can hide the stars entirely. Reliable navigation always depended on layers of experience working together. By evening, choosing a campsite became another skill in its own right. Water nearby was ideal, but water sources also attracted strangers, and sometimes bandits. An exposed site could be battered by wind. A camp too close to the foot of a mountain could be vulnerable to flash floods. Caravans looked for level ground, shelter from the wind, and a place with a clear view of the surroundings. Only after the camels were unloaded could they rest, and only then could the people finally sit down. After a few days, swallowing dry rations with cold water could feel unbearable, so whenever a fire was possible, everyone wanted something hot. Someone might soften flatbread beside the flames. Someone else might boil a meat broth and add dried fruit for flavor. Travelers from different regions brought different habits with them. which meant food became one of the earliest places where cultures began to mix. History does not change the first time someone tastes an unfamiliar dish. History changes when that person goes home, says, "That was good," and starts making it himself. At night, people took turns standing watch. The desert was never completely silent. Wind moved softly across the sand. Camels snorted from time to time. Somewhere in the distance, an animal might call. Sitting beside a fire, it was easy to think of home. The cruelest part of ancient long-distance travel was not always danger. It was time. To us, 2,000 kilometers is a few seconds of zooming across a digital map. To an ancient traveler, it might mean months. When he left, his child had only just learned to walk. By the time he returned, the child might be calling someone else uncle. When he left, his mother was still healthy. By the time he came home, white mourning cloth might already have hung outside the door. Merchants accepted these costs for more than the possibility of enormous profit. Some simply had few alternatives. Perhaps there was not enough land. Perhaps the family was in debt. Perhaps they had inherited a trading business. Not everyone on the road carried a romantic dream of exploring the world. Many were simply trying to earn a living, and that makes the Silk Road more real. Human beings often create grand history while trying to solve very small personal problems. The next morning, only ashes remain from the fire. The caravan moves on. Days later, trees appear in the distance. To someone crossing a desert for the first time, no palace could be more beautiful than a line of green. Trees mean water. Water means a city. Inside an oasis, the world suddenly fills with sound again. Blacksmiths hammer tools. Children run through the streets. Merchants shout prices. Animals crowd around watering troughs. At an inn, the first question a traveler asks may not be how much a room costs, but where he can find water to wash his face. Here, a caravan does three things: rest, exchange information, reorganize the cargo. Some goods may be sold in this very city because carrying them farther west is no longer worth the cost. New goods are loaded in their place. A merchant arriving from China with silk might leave with jade, horses, great products, or glassware that had already traveled from somewhere much farther away. That is why the Silk Road was never a road that carried only silk. In many periods, silk was just one commodity among many. The name Silk Road is powerful because silk is such a vivid symbol of high-value, long-distance trade. But the real routes carried woolen cloth, leather, metalwork, medicines, spices, gemstones, paper, ceramics, horses, enslaved people, and countless local products. Among all the living cargo, horses were especially important. Emperor Wu of Han's interest in the fine horses of the Yuan was closely tied to the needs of Han cavalry. The famous blood-sweating horses described in historical texts have acquired a legendary aura, and scholars have offered different explanations for both their exact breed and the reports that they sweated blood. There is no need to identify them too neatly with any single modern breed. What is historically clear is that the Han court placed great value on the superior horses of the Fergana Valley. The Han even launched military expeditions to obtain them. War reveals another side of trade. When a commodity becomes important enough to affect military power, a market is no longer just a market. Horses can be exchanged for silk. Silk can become a diplomatic gift. Trade routes can become military roads. A city can grow rich because of commerce and be fought over because of its location. Lulan is a perfect example of that fate. It was not important because it was mysterious. It was important because so many people needed to pass nearby. What made a Silk Road city wealthy was not scenery. It was location. If the main route bypassed you, prosperity could disappear quickly. If two routes met at your gates, inns, markets, warehouses, and tax revenue could all appear together. So when we look at a map of the ancient Silk Road, The most important things to search for are not straight lines. Look for water sources, mountain passes, river valleys, and crossroads. Roads obey geography. Empires can only alter it for a while. Continuing west along the northern route, we come to Quanzhou. Quanzhou was not only a commercial center. It was also one of the most important regions in the history of Buddhism's transmission. The Quanzhou caves near Quanzhou preserve a remarkable body of murals. Wealth brought by caravans, support from rulers, and the activity of monks and believers all help sustain these religious centers. In the Silk Road world, a monastery could be more than a place of worship. It might also offer travelers a place to stay, a place to exchange information, food, and sometimes protection. Merchants donated money to build temples. Monks traveled the same commercial routes. Trade and religion developed a relationship that was not strange at all, but deeply practical. This was one of the conditions that allowed Buddhism to cross enormous distances. Buddhism originated in South Asia and spread eastward through Gandhara, Central Asia, and multiple regions of the Darien Basin. But it was not carried from India to China as a perfectly sealed package, unchanged along the way. Every new language, every new city, and every new community of believers brought new interpretations. A Buddhist scripture moving from Sanskrit or another Indian language into Central Asia might first be interpreted by a bilingual monk, translated into a Central Asian language, and only later enter the Chinese-speaking world. The very act of searching for an equivalent word in another language could change a concept. The same was true of Buddhist imagery. Gandharan art had been shaped in part by Hellenistic traditions, visible in the drapery, hairstyles, and forms of its human figures. As these visual traditions moved into Central and East Asia, they blended with local aesthetics. A Buddha image seen in a cave today may be the product of centuries of encounters among several different artistic traditions. The Silk Road, then, rarely delivered anything completely unchanged. It was more like a giant machine of transformation. Goods were repriced. Stories were retold. Religions were reinterpreted. Music was performed in new ways. Food was cooked differently. And precisely because all of these things changed, they were able to become part of life in new societies. If we want to see the most human side of the Silk Road, Dunhuang offers one of our rarest windows. In the early 20th century, large collections of documents discovered in and around Dunhuang allowed modern readers to move beyond emperors and generals and hear the voices of merchants, monks, and ordinary people. Among the most famous of these materials are the Sogdian ancient letters from the early 4th century. The Sogdians came from Transoxiana in Central Asia, with particularly strong ties to the region around Samarkand. From roughly the 5th to the 8th centuries, they became one of Central Asia's most important communities of long-distance traders. They never created a vast Eurasian empire ruled by Sogdians themselves. Instead, they built a different kind of power, a network of relatives, people from the same hometowns, business partners, and diaspora communities. They lived and traded in northwestern China, in Central Asian oases, and farther beyond. Many spoke several languages and became skilled at finding room to operate between competing political powers. What makes the Sogdian ancient letters so compelling is that they do not celebrate civilizational exchange. They talk about life. Some discuss business and cargo. Others describe political conditions in China. One famous letter was written by a Sogdian woman whose husband had left her in Dunhuang for a long time. Her frustration remains unmistakable 17 centuries later. Her husband had gone away. Money had not arrived. She and her children were struggling to survive. This is not grand historical narrative. is the price paid by an ordinary family for long-distance trade. When we say, a caravan passed through Dunhuang, it sounds romantic, but on the day a caravan left, someone always stayed behind. A wife might not know when her husband would return. Parents might not know whether their son had died in the desert. A child might go years without seeing a father. A merchant might remain in one city so long that he simply settled there. His children might speak the local language and wear local clothes while still preserving the religion and family names of their ancestors. A few generations later, their identity could become far more complicated. That is how the Silk Road truly changed societies. Not through one grand ceremonial handshake, but through thousands of families slowly changing the way they lived. Sogdian merchants later became so important partly because they were especially well suited to the Silk Road's relay-style system of trade. So let us return once more to the bolt of silk from the beginning of our story. No single person needed to carry it from Chang'an all the way to the Mediterranean. More realistically, it changed hands segment by segment. One merchant knew the route from Chang'an to Dunhuang. Another knew Dunhuang to Gaochang. Someone else specialized in crossing the mountain passes. Another understood the markets between Samarkand and Persia. Every segment carried its own risks. Every node imposed different taxes and offered different margins. This helps explain why silk could travel farther than the people who traded it. An ordinary merchant might spend his whole life moving between only 2 or 3 cities, while his goods continued far beyond them. Why was silk so well suited to long-distance trade? Because it was light, expensive, and easy to carry. Long-distance transport fears 2 things: weight and low value. If you haul a cartload of cheap grain for thousands of kilometers, the cost of feeding people and animals along the way may exceed the value of the grain itself. Silk was different. It took up relatively little space and weighed relatively little, yet could represent enormous value. Inside China, silk was not only clothing material. At various times, it also functioned as a reward, a form of payment, an exchange good. In Central Asia, it became both an elite luxury and a medium of regional trade. The Western world was genuinely fascinated by silk. Writers in the Roman era knew of silken textiles arriving from the distant East. Pliny the Elder complained that Roman demand for Eastern luxuries was draining wealth away, while Seneca criticized thin silk clothing on moral grounds. We should not turn these complaints into a story in which the Roman state repeatedly imposed some universal ban on silk. But they do tell us one important thing. Silk was visible enough in Roman elite culture to make moralists uncomfortable. By the time a Roman aristocratic woman purchased a piece of silk, however, it may have been almost impossible to tell where it had originally been woven, or how many times it had changed hands. It might first have entered Central Asia and then passed to Parthian or other West Asian merchants. The Parthian Empire controlled important parts of the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, and its geography made it a natural intermediary in east-west trade. Farther east, the Kushan Empire at different times controlled important regions of southern Central Asia and northern India, strengthening the connections among Central Asia, South Asia, and the major east-west routes. So if we imagine the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire as 2 giants standing at opposite ends of the road, reaching out to trade directly with each other, we miss the real protagonists. The people who actually kept goods moving were the cities and communities in between, the ones that can look less great in traditional histories. In Bactria, the Sogdian cities, Kushan territories, Parthian cities, the markets of Mesopotamia, Syria, and Mediterranean ports, these regions were not empty space between civilizations. They were some of the busiest parts of the entire Silk Road system. The Han did make efforts to learn more about the Far West. During the Eastern Han period, Ban Chao spent many years expanding and maintaining Han influence in the western regions. He sent Gan Ing farther west to gather information about Daqin, the name used in Chinese sources for the Roman world. Gan Ing traveled a remarkable distance, but he did not actually reach Rome. Scholars still debate the exact location of the Western Sea he reached, so the safest conclusion is that he arrived somewhere in West Asia near a major body of water, obtained information about lands farther west, and ultimately did not make the sea crossing. In 166 CE, Eastern Han records also describe visitors who claimed to be envoys from King Anduin of Daqin. Scholars still debate whether this was truly an official mission sent by a Roman emperor or a group of merchants using diplomatic status to facilitate trade. Either way, the episode suggests that by the 2nd century, people at the far ends of Eurasia had at least some awareness of each other's existence. Awareness is not the same as familiarity. Chinese ideas about Rome were mixed with secondhand reports, just as Roman ideas about the eastern land of the Ceres remained vague. The most accurate information often belonged to intermediaries, and intermediaries did not necessarily want buyers and sellers bypassing them. That gave the Silk Road a surprisingly modern commercial logic. The farther away the market, the more valuable the information. The person who knew which route was safe, who knew the local officials, who could speak 3 or 4 languages, and who knew the real price of a commodity in the next city had an advantage. The daily life of a caravan was far less romantic than later paintings suggest. People rose before dawn. The ropes securing cargo had to be checked. The camel's feet and skin had to be examined for injuries. Water had to be rationed according to the distance ahead. Guides judged the weather from wind direction, cloud patterns, and traces on ground. Once deep in the desert, travelers tried to avoid spending too long on the move during the hottest part of the day. The best possible outcome was to reach a water source by dusk and make camp nearby. The food was never elaborate. Dry flatbread, dairy products, dried meat, dried fruit, anything that could keep for a long time was useful. Water mattered more than wine, and sometimes salt mattered more than spices. On the road, the height of luxury might be nothing more than a bowl of hot soup, or a night in an inn where no one had to stand watch. Night, however, was when the Silk Road most easily stirred the imagination. Without city lights, the stars over the desert could appear astonishingly bright. Merchants sat around the fire and talked. People from different regions might not understand one another, but someone could usually serve as an interpreter. One person talked about the weather. Another asked about prices. Someone else told a strange story about something seen on the road. That is how stories traveled. An Indian tale reaching Central Asia might acquire new names for its characters. When it reached China, it might be interpreted again. Music moved in much the same way. Melody crosses borders more easily than language. Instruments, dances, and musical traditions from Central and West Asia entered China and became especially prominent during the Sui and Tang periods. Instruments such as the pipa, gongho, and bili were absorbed into different musical systems, entering both the imperial court and the entertainment culture of great cities like Chang'an. Food traveled more quietly. Grapes, pomegranates, walnuts, alfalfa, and many spices and plants reached China along different routes. In other periods, Chinese silk, lacquerware, paper, and ceramics moved outward. The precise path of any single item can be complicated, and not every food with the old Chinese label, meaning something foreign or Western, can simply be declared a product of the Western regions. But the larger pattern is unmistakable. Over centuries of exchange, the tables of Eurasia changed. The greatest sign that a trade route has succeeded is not the number of foreign goods in a marketplace. It is the day when people suddenly realize that yesterday's foreign thing has become part of everyday life. If we continue west through the oases and cross the Pamirs, the colors of the world change again. The yellow sands of the Darim Basin fall behind. Mountains and grasslands appear. Now, the caravan faces more than a lack of water. There is altitude, snow and ice, and weather that can change without warning. To ancient travelers, the passes of the Pamirs could seem almost impossible. Animals breathe harder. People suffer headaches and nausea. When snow covers the path, only someone who knows the land can read the shape of the mountains and find a safer way through. But once the passes are crossed, Central Asia lies ahead. Fergana, Sogdian, Bactria, and the roads leading toward the Iranian plateau turn the center of Eurasia into a true crossroads. One city deserves a longer stop: Samarkand. Today, the name Samarkand often brings to mind blue domes and magnificent Islamic architecture. But centuries before those monuments were built, Samarkand was already a major center of the Sogdian world. The Eurasian Valley provided a strong agricultural base, while the city sat within a region where Central Asian routes converged. For a merchant arriving from the east, Samarkand was not the end of the journey. It was the entrance to another commercial network. The goods in the market begin to look different here. Chinese silk is still valuable, but now there are also gold and silver vessels, glassware, spices, and textiles from Iran and West Asia. Gems, spices, and religious objects arrive from the direction of India along north-south routes. Steppe peoples bring horses, furs, and livestock products. Some goods have already traveled astonishing distances before they appear for sale. Ancient people could not always say exactly where an object came from. Often, a merchant knew only the person who sold it to him. That is one reason ancient texts so often contain hazy geographical ideas. If an author writes that a particular gemstone comes from a certain kingdom, it may simply mean that he saw the stone for sale there. It does not necessarily mean the mine was located there. Markets create their own geography. People tend to imagine a commodity's homeland as the place where they bought it. Samarkand's greatest strength was not simply the number of things for sale. It was the number of people. What a merchant needed most was a network of relationships. A stranger arriving in Samarkand from Dunhuang could not easily enter high-value trade without letters of introduction, relatives, people from the same hometown, or established partners. He needed to know who could be trusted, who regularly failed to pay debts, who had the protection of local elites, and who offered suspiciously low prices because the goods might be fake. This is where the Sogdian commercial network had an enormous advantage. A young man could learn languages and bookkeeping from relatives, then be introduced to people from his community in another city. A local Sogdian community could provide lodging, information, and credit. Once commercial relationships extended across several generations, the network became more important than any single road. If a road failed, you could take another road. As long as the relationship survived, business could continue. This may be the most modern feature of the Silk Road. The most valuable thing was not always the commodity. It was the network. During the centuries when Sogdians were most active, Central Asia was not always united under a single political power. Sogdian merchants had to deal with different rulers, Turkic powers, local city-states, and Chinese dynasties. Some even took part in diplomacy because they knew the languages and understood the rules of several political worlds. Their cooperation with Turkic powers in the 6th century is especially important. After the Turkic Khaganate gained control over vast areas of the steppe, Sogdians were able to expand their commercial activity through those political networks. The Sogdian language also served important functions in some political and administrative settings. Once a commercial language enters diplomacy, it is no longer merely the language of the marketplace. A long-distance merchant might need to be an interpreter, a diplomat, a financial intermediary, and an intelligence gatherer at the same time. That sounds like the profile of a legendary adventurer. In reality, it was a practical requirement of cross-cultural trade. If a merchant knew how to bargain, but not how to behave according to local custom, he might not even get through the city gate. If he spoke 3 languages but used the wrong title and insulted the person across the table, the negotiation could fail before it began. What Silk Road merchants truly learned was adaptability. And adaptability changed them too. A Sogdian merchant who lived in China for many years might change his clothes, change his name, and raise children who spoke a different language. Yet religious images inside the family home, or the rituals used at burial, might still preserve traditions inherited from his ancestors. This is what makes Sogdian tombs discovered by archaeologists so fascinating. Scenes carved onto stone couches and screens often show banquets, hunting, journeys, and religious ceremonies. They are not formal written histories. They look more like family photo albums in stone. What did a family want the dead to remember in the next world? Feasts, journeys, gods, horses, camels, traditions from home. These images remind us that no single label, such as foreigner, can explain Silk Road identity. Everyone lived some version of a mixed life. West of Samarkand, caravans gradually entered regions more strongly shaped by Iranian culture. After the Parthians, Sasanian Persia became one of the great powers of West Asia. It controlled the Iranian plateau and parts of Mesopotamia and competed for centuries with Rome and, later, Byzantium. Here, war and trade existed side by side in a way that can seem almost contradictory. Borders could be at war. Merchants still wanted to do business. Hostility between empires did not mean all goods stopped moving. Aristocrats on both sides still desired luxuries, and governments still wanted customs revenue. In periods of political tension, intermediaries could become even more important. Glassware from Persia and Central Asia was particularly attractive in Eastern markets. Glass was not completely unknown in ancient China, but West Asia had long traditions of sophisticated glass production. Transparent cups in brilliant colors and complex shapes could become elite luxury goods when they reached China. Imagine a Tang aristocrat holding a truly transparent glass cup for the first time. What surprises him most may not be the price. It may be the simple fact that he can see another person through the wall of the cup. To us, that is utterly ordinary. But when a new material first enters daily life, the visual shock can be extraordinary. The same thing happened when people in the West first encountered large quantities of Chinese porcelain. Human fascination with exotic goods often begins with the material itself. Silk is impossibly light. Glass is astonishingly transparent. Porcelain is strikingly white. Spices are intensely fragrant. Before these things acquire cultural meaning, they first surprise the senses. The Persian world carried the routes onward toward Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. If our bolt of silk kept traveling west, it might enter markets around Ctesiphon, then move through Syria, Mediterranean ports, or other routes into the commercial systems of Rome and, later, Byzantium. But by this point, it would no longer be quite accurate to call it an original Han Chinese product. Some silk was rewoven. Some patterns were copied locally. Some craftspeople tried to uncover the secrets of sericulture. By the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire was gradually developing its own silk production. Traditional accounts, including those associated with Procopius, tell the famous story of monks carrying silkworm eggs into Byzantium hidden inside hollow staffs. The real process was probably more complicated than the legend. Sericulture technology may have moved west gradually through Central Asia and other channels. What matters most is the result. Silk no longer had only one center of production. Once a technology begins to travel, it is difficult to keep it secret forever. That pattern appears again and again along the Silk Road. Trade in finished goods eventually encourages imitation of the technology that produced them. If people spend enough time paying high prices for something, sooner or later they try to make it themselves. Ceramics did this. Glass did this. Paper did this. Silk did this too. Trade can make one region rich, but over time, it can also weaken that region's original technological monopoly. Markets teach other people how to replace you. It sounds harsh, but it is also one of the engines of technological diffusion. Farther west, Constantinople became both a major destination and a transfer hub in Eurasian trade. The city commanded the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and goods from the east entered European markets through it. But if we actually stood on a quay in Constantinople, we would not see a sign announcing the end of the Silk Road. We would see people, boatmen, porters, customs officials, merchants, buyers. Perhaps one day, a roll of silk that had begun its journey in the distant east was opened right there on the waterfront. The buyer touched it with his hand. He did not know what a mulberry tree looked like. He did not know where Dunhuang was. He did not know what language people spoke in Samarkand. And he did not know how many people had crossed deserts so that this cloth could reach him. He asked only one question: how much? Thousands of kilometers of history ended in the marketplace as a price. That is the most ordinary conclusion to trade. But once the transaction was complete, cultural influence was only beginning. Patterns from Byzantium and Persia moved east. Silk-making techniques moved west. Religions, stories, music, and art kept moving with people. Different faiths could even become literal neighbors in Silk Road cities. Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Manichaeism, the Church of the East, and later Islam all left traces in different parts of the Silk Road world. An oasis city might contain several religions at the same time. A traveler could see a Buddhist temple in the morning, walk 2 streets, and pass a Zoroastrian shrine, and in a later century find a mosque in the same city. A new faith did not completely erase an older city's memories. Culture accumulates in layers. When archaeologists dig downward, they find different generations leaving traces in the same ground. Central Asia makes this especially visible. Samarkand passed through many political and religious eras, and its architecture was rebuilt again and again. Most of the famous blue monuments seen by visitors today date to centuries after the golden age of the Sogdian merchants. Using those buildings as a backdrop for a Han or Tang era story creates a historical mismatch. To experience history properly, we have to accept one fact: the same city can have many faces. We cannot use 15th century Samarkand to decorate a 7th century story. And we cannot place the prosperity of Song and Yuan-era Quanzhou into the Han Dynasty. Time itself is part of the Silk Road. Only when time enters the story do the cities begin to breathe. By the Sui and Tang periods, this network entered one of the great flourishing ages of overland exchange. Tang Chang'an was one of the largest and most populous cities in the world of its time. If we really want to understand the prosperity of the Silk Road under the Tang, the best place to begin is not inside a palace. It is in the ordinary life of the city. Chang'an wakes first through sound. At dawn, neighborhood and market gates open according to regulation, and the streets gradually fill. First come people carrying loads on shoulder poles, then riders on horseback, delivery carts, and traders driving livestock. Smoke rises from kitchens. The smell of cooked flour mixes with the smell of animals. Some people are heading to government offices, some to temples, some to the markets. For a merchant from the western regions entering Chang'an for the first time, The greatest shock may be the scale of the city. The streets are wide. There are people everywhere. The rules are strict. Different districts have clearly defined functions. But he quickly discovers that he is not alone. Communities of Central Asian merchants already live here. Some trade in spices. Some run wine shops. Some sell jewelry and fine vessels. Others enter official service. Epitaphs discovered by archaeologists allow us to trace some Sogdian families living in China across several generations. In the city's foreigners are not one single group. There are people from different Sogdian city-states. There are Persians. There are monks and merchants from India and lands farther west. There are envoys and students from the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago. They have come to Chang'an for different reasons. Some for money, some for knowledge, some for office, some for faith. A city does not become truly international simply because there are lots of foreigners. What matters is whether those people actually become part of one another's lives. They rent homes, buy groceries, do business, marry, raise children, go to court, borrow money, celebrate festivals. Only at that point does cross-cultural exchange stop being a performance and become ordinary life. Tang texts and art frequently depict people described as who, often with deep-set eyes and prominent noses, foreign clothing, horses, camel caravans, music, and dance. But artistic images tend to exaggerate exotic features. We cannot treat every ceramic figurine as if it were a census record. Real foreign residents in history did not spend every day wearing ethnic costumes simply to remind everyone where they came from. Over time, clothing blended, diets changed, languages mixed, names changed too, and those changes are some of the most interesting parts of the story. The first generation of a family might speak only a little Chinese. The second might be bilingual. The third might speak mostly Chinese, while still knowing that a grandfather came from Samarkand. Another generation later, an epitaph might still mention the family's ancestry, even though everyday life had become thoroughly local. Cultural integration is not two colors stirred together until they instantly become a third. It takes generations. Food in Tang Chang'an gives us one of the clearest ways to feel that process. Grapes and wine traditions from Central and West Asia had entered China long before, but during the Tang they became especially visible in elite and urban culture. Baked breads, such as so-called hu cakes, were also common. The growing use of spices expanded the range of both foods and medicines. But we should resist the temptation to claim that any modern dish already existed in the Tang in exactly the same form we know today. Names, shapes, and cooking methods change. Ancient terms such as wonton, bing, and hu bing do not always correspond neatly to a single modern food. We do not need to force a modern dish to find an ancient ancestor in order to make history interesting. It is enough to imagine a Tang resident walking into a restaurant with flavors from the western regions for the first time. A fire burns against the wall. Dough is slapped flat. Meat roasts over the heat. Spices hit hot oil. Nearby, someone pours wine made for grapes. Perhaps the flavors seem strange, but he comes back again. A few decades later, they no longer seem strange at all. Music could change even faster. A band does not need to wait for several generations. Put a few musicians from different traditions on the same stage, and a new sound can appear immediately. As Central Asian musical traditions entered the Chinese heartland, instruments, melodies, and dances were absorbed by both court culture and popular entertainment. The pipa became especially prominent in Tang culture. Today, many people think of the pipa as quintessentially Chinese. That is exactly what successful cultural transmission looks like. Eventually, people forget how much foreign influence and local reinvention shaped the thing they now regard as their own. The so-called Sogdian whirl was another dance frequently mentioned in Tang literature and art. The dancer spun rapidly, producing a striking visual effect. The dance reflected influences from the Central Asian cultural world and became popular in both the Tang court and urban entertainment. Poets wrote about it. Painters depicted it. Audiences imitated it. By the time a dance traveled from around Samarkand to Chang'an, its movements might have changed. Its costumes might have changed. Its instrumental accompaniment might have changed. Even the audience's understanding of it might have changed. And yet it could still preserve a kind of physical memory from far away. That is how art travels. It does not need a passport. The movement of religion was more complicated. Tang Chang'an was home not only to Buddhism, but also to foreign religious traditions, including Zoroastrianism, the Church of the East, and Manichaeism. Different faiths received different degrees of official permission and social space at different times. It would be misleading to say that all religions always coexisted equally under the Tang, because policies changed and political conditions changed with them. But during certain periods, Chang'an genuinely supported an extraordinarily diverse religious life. Imagine an ordinary resident of the city. He may never study Zoroastrian doctrine, but he knows there is a Zoroastrian temple nearby. He cannot read Syriac, but he knows there are Christians whose communities came from the direction of Persia. He may never travel to India, yet he can enter a Buddhist temple and see religious images whose origins lie in South Asia. The wider world has entered his city. That is the most visible result of a flourishing Silk Road. You do not have to leave home to encounter somewhere far away. Life on the Tang frontier looked very different. Travel west from Chang'an again into the Hushi corridor and the western regions, and the cities become smaller while the military presence becomes stronger. Beacon towers, city walls, military farms, and garrisons are closely tied to the commercial roads. In peacetime, soldiers protect traffic. In wartime, those same armies can block it. What merchants feared was not always the mere fact that a war had begun. What they feared was that war made the rules stop working. Yesterday, a tax payment got you through a checkpoint. Today, the garrison has changed. Yesterday, your travel permit was valid. Tomorrow, no one recognizes it. Yesterday, you had a relationship with a local ruler. Today, he has been overthrown. Commerce needs predictability. The less predictable the politics, the higher the potential profit must be before merchants will accept the risk. That is one reason Silk Road goods could become so expensive. Risk was built into the price. The Tang poet Xin Shun spent years serving in the western regions, and his frontier poetry preserves remarkably vivid descriptions of the landscape. Powerful winds, snow, bitter cold, desolation. These were not images from a travel brochure. They were conditions people actually lived with. Today, we may look at a desert sunset and call it magnificent. An ancient soldier looking at the same sunset might only be thinking about tomorrow's patrol. Who you are changes what you see. A merchant looks at a mountain pass and thinks of transit. A soldier looks at the same pass and thinks of defense. A monk thinks of the next monastery. Only the poet may look at it and think of a poem. One road can carry many meanings at the same time. Khotan is another oasis worth pausing in. It was famous for jade and also served for centuries as an important center of Buddhism. Jade from the Kunlun region had moved east through regional exchange networks from very early times, showing that trade between the Chinese heartland and southern Xinjiang long predated formal Han involvement in the western regions. Jade and silk have something in common. Neither is necessary for survival. Yet cultural value can make both extraordinarily important. The high status of jade in Chinese culture created a long-term market for stone from the Khotan region. Merchants did not carry jade because it could feed anyone. They carried it because society had invested it with ritual meaning, status, and beauty. Value has never come from usefulness alone. A stone can drive trade across thousands of kilometers simply because enough people agree that it is precious. In the Gaochang and Turpan regions, the dry climate gave archaeologists another kind of gift. Paper, textiles, food remains, and other organic materials can sometimes survive exceptionally well. Cemeteries such as Astana have produced large numbers of documents and everyday objects, revealing that life in the Tang-era western regions was about far more than soldiers and caravans. People had to eat, wear clothes, marry, borrow money, get sick, be buried. Perhaps the greatest archaeological value of the Silk Road is that it keeps reminding us of one thing. What we call civilizational exchange eventually has to reach the human body. New cloth is worn on the skin. New foods are eaten. New medicines are used to treat illness. New religions offer ways to understand death. New music makes people dance. Without changes like these, exchange is only an abstract word. After the Lushan Rebellion, political connections between Chang'an and the western regions were severely disrupted, and the position of Sogdians in China changed as well. Some gradually concealed or downplayed their foreign origins. Others merged more deeply into local society. Silk Road commerce did not stop immediately, but the older system, supported jointly by Tang power in the western regions and Sogdian commercial networks, changed dramatically. This is where it is very easy to make a mistake. To write the Tang Dynasty declined as though it automatically meant the Silk Road declined. The two are not the same thing. From the perspective of a Chinese dynasty, control over the western regions weakened. From the perspective of Central Asia, however, local societies continue to live. New rulers took over old cities. New merchants used old roads. Farther west, the Islamic world was developing new cities and new commercial systems. History does not stop moving simply because one center loses power. The center of movement changes. From the 9th and 10th centuries onward, Central Asia gradually entered a new political and cultural era. Islam spread more deeply through the region. Older languages, such as Sogdian, gave way to new linguistic environments, and Sogdian commercial communities were gradually absorbed into other societies. So did the once dominant merchants disappear? If we mean the Sogdians as a distinct long-distance commercial people, then yes, their golden age came to an end. But what they left behind did not vanish. The trade routes remained. The cities remained. The descendants of many families remained. Words survived in languages. Artistic influences survived. What history calls disappearance is often only the disappearance of a name. People do not evaporate. They become part of someone else's ancestry. People from Central Asia, West Asia, South Asia, the Korean Peninsula, and the Japanese archipelago came to Chinese cities. Some are envoys, some are monks, some are students, some are merchants, and some settled permanently. Imagine another morning in Tang Chang'an. After the drums sound, the markets slowly open. Shops remove the boards from their fronts. Pack animals enter the streets. Spice merchants straighten their sacks. Steam rises from bread ovens. Shopkeepers begin calculating yesterday's accounts. The owner of one shop may have ancestors from Samarkand, yet he himself was born in Chang'an and speaks fluent Chinese. Inside his household, two different sets of customs may coexist. Outside, he conducts business according to the rules of a Tang city. At home, his family may still perform religious rites inherited from their ancestors. Sogdian diaspora communities left behind many tombs and inscriptions in China from the northern dynasties through the Tang. Archaeology shows that they were not simply foreign merchants passing through. Some entered local society, holding offices connected to the management of their own communities or to commerce. Families could live in northern Chinese cities for generations. Children might adopt Chinese surnames. Marriage patterns changed as well. By this point, the Silk Road was no longer only about moving goods. It was producing mixed identities. Where is a person really from? His birthplace or his ancestral home? His language or his religion? The clothes he wears in life or the ritual used to bury him after death. The Silk Road does not give us simple answers. Another fascinating group on the roads of the Tang world were Buddhist monks. Merchants traveled for profit. Monks traveled for faith. Their goals were different, but they often used the same routes. Around 399 CE, Qian left China and traveled through Central Asia toward India in search of more complete texts of Buddhist monastic discipline. He was no longer a young man, yet he still undertook an enormous journey. Along the way, he recorded cities, monasteries, and religious life, and eventually returned by sea. Reading his travel account today, we find that he was not especially interested in exotic scenery. He wanted to know where Buddhism flourished, where it was declining, how monks lived, and whether the disciplinary texts were complete. Precisely because those were his concerns, he unintentionally preserved invaluable observations of many parts of Central and South Asia in the early 5th century. More than 2 centuries later, Xuanzang followed a similar road. Xuanzang lived under the Tang Dynasty. The problem that drove him was highly specialized. Buddhist scriptures that had reached China existed in differing versions, and he wanted to find more reliable and complete texts and study them in depth. Around 629 CE, he left Chang'an, crossed the Hushi corridor and the western regions, passed through the mountains of Central Asia, and eventually reached India, where he studied at major Buddhist centers, including Nalanda. Later literature transformed Xuanzang's journey into one of the inspirations for Journey to the West. As a result, many people hear his name and immediately think of the Monkey King and demons. But the real Xuanzang had no supernatural powers, no magic cloud, no single leap across 108,000 li. And that makes the real journey even more remarkable. He faced thirst, the risk of getting lost, language barriers, political frontiers, thin mountain air, and the simple burden of time. Xuanzang studied in India for years and returned to China in 645 CE with a large collection of Buddhist texts. He then devoted himself to a long program of translation. The Great Tang records on the western regions, based on his account, became not only a source for religious history, but also a major text for the historical geography of Central and South Asia. From Qian to Xuanzang, we learn that the people who traveled farthest on the Silk Road were not always the richest. Sometimes they were the most determined. The movement of monks also reshaped art and cities. The Mogao caves at Dunhuang are one of the clearest examples. Cave construction at Dunhuang began in the 4th century CE and continued for many centuries. The murals and sculptures inside are not isolated works of religious art. They preserve traces of clothing, musical instruments, architecture, transport, merchants, travelers, and the blending of different cultural elements. Even more important, discoveries including the library cave preserve an enormous body of documents written not only in Chinese, but also in Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Khotanese, and other languages. Alongside religious texts are contracts, letters, accounts, and other records of ordinary life. If we truly want to experience the Silk Road, we can step away from grand dynastic history for a moment and walk into an ordinary room in Dunhuang. There may be a contract lying on the table. A merchant has borrowed something and must specify when it will be returned. If laborers or transport workers are hired, their pay has to be agreed in advance. Land, livestock, and bolts of cloth can all become objects of exchange. As soon as humans begin long-distance commerce, they encounter the problem of credit. Who receives the cargo? Who pays if it is damaged? When must a loan be repaid? What if the other party disappears? That is why contracts, witnesses, seals, and trusted personal networks became so important. The Silk Road did not run on courage alone. It also ran on bookkeeping. Romantic historical films love camel bells and desert sunsets. They rarely show a merchant sitting under an oil lamp at night, checking his accounts. But in the real commercial world, balancing the books was probably far more common than drawing his sword against bandits. Once a genuine trade network forms, it also creates specialized urban professions. Someone raises camels. Someone repairs saddles and harnesses. Someone runs an inn. Someone changes money. Someone works as an interpreter. Someone writes letters for caravans. Someone else provides armed protection. When a large caravan passes through, the benefits do not go only to the merchant selling goods. An entire service economy grows around the traffic. So the Silk Road is not simply a story about adventurers. It was a system supported by countless ordinary occupations. That system flourished in the early and middle Tang period, but every transcontinental network depends heavily on political stability. After the middle of the 8th century, internal turmoil in the Tang Dynasty and changes in the political landscape of Central Asia altered the conditions of overland trade. After the Eurasian rebellion, Tang power in the western regions contracted, and control over the Hashi corridor and the Darim region changed hands repeatedly. Sogdian commercial networks were also badly disrupted. But we should not say the Eurasian rebellion happened and the Silk Road ended. Trade did not disappear overnight, and local merchants did not automatically stop doing business simply because a different flag flew over the government offices. A more accurate way to understand it is this. The old network began to change. When one route became dangerous, merchants went around it. When overland costs rose, maritime routes became more attractive. When one trading community's network weakened, other merchants moved into part of the space it left behind. The Silk Road never vanished completely just because one empire declined. It changed shape and continued. And while the overland world was being rearranged, another, even broader network was becoming increasingly important across the sea. Maritime exchange was not suddenly invented in the Tang or Song period. Long before then, active seaborne trade already linked the South China Sea and the coasts of the Indian Ocean. Sailors in different regions had learned to work with a monsoon system. During one season, the prevailing winds carried ships in one direction. Months later, the reversed winds could carry them back. To understand the wind was to understand the timetable of the sea. Overland travelers feared running out of water. At sea, the danger could be being surrounded by far too much of it. Once a ship left port, water stretched in every direction, yet fresh water remained limited. Food spoiled. Hull planks leaked. Storms could throw a route completely off course. Sailors needed knowledge of winds, currents, stars, and coastal geography. A large merchant vessel also required complex division of labor: steering, handling sails, repairs, cargo management, cooking, record-keeping. Every task mattered, but maritime trade had one advantage over land transport that was impossible to ignore: capacity. A camel can carry only so much. A large merchant ship can carry goods by the ton, and that quietly changes which commodities are worth moving over long distances. Overland routes favor goods that are valuable but light. Once maritime routes become mature and reliable, commodities such as ceramics gain an enormous advantage. Porcelain can break, but it is not vulnerable to moisture and insects in quite the same way as silk. More importantly, a ship can carry huge quantities of it at once. From the Tang and Song periods onward, Chinese ceramics become increasingly visible in maritime trade. If the classic image of the early Silk Road is a camel caravan, then perhaps the best image for its middle and later phases is a ship's hold packed with ceramic bowls. And that ship is slowly sailing toward Quanzhou. During the Song and Yuan periods, Quanzhou became one of the most important ports in East Asian maritime trade. Standing near the remains of the old harbor today, it is difficult to reconstruct the scene completely. These waters were not occupied by a few lonely fishing boats. Merchant vessels from different seas arrived and departed in steady traffic. Near the harbor, workers carried ceramics, merchants weighed spices, shipwrights checked hull planks, and crews waited for favorable winds. Traders from Southeast Asia, South Asia, and West Asia lived in the city for long periods. They brought their languages, religions, and food customs with them, while carrying goods produced or collected around Quanzhou to distant coasts. A truly international port must have sounded chaotic. On the docks, you might hear local Minnan speech alongside languages brought by overseas merchants. Someone bargains over a shipload of pepper. Someone checks the packing around ceramic wares. Someone else is looking for the next vessel heading out to sea. The city's Buddhist temples, Taoist temples, mosques, and other religious remains still remind us that the maritime Silk Road did not bring only goods into port. People stayed too. Some came for a season and left. Some came for a lifetime. In essence, this was the same historical process that had led Sogdian merchants to settle in Chang'an centuries earlier. Where the road goes, home may follow. Shift the camera from Chang'an and Dunhuang out to sea, and we encounter a completely different rhythm of life. On land, time is marked by camel bells. At sea, it is marked by the monsoon. In the Indian Ocean, wind is not scenery, it is the sailing calendar. Merchants had to wait for the right season to depart. Missing the wind could mean spending several extra months in port. Port cities, therefore, developed a natural culture of waiting. The ship is loaded. The cargo has been purchased. The crew is ready. But the wind has not come, so the merchant waits. While waiting, traders rent houses, conduct business, and form relationships with local people. So begin families there. Monsoon trade, therefore, did more than connect ports. It created overseas communities. Quanzhou's international character was closely tied to this pattern of extended residence. A merchant from West Asia might originally plan to stay for 6 months. Then weather, business, and family keep him there for decades. His children are born in Quanzhou and grow up speaking the local language, while learning the family's religion from their father. When those children become adults, they face questions of identity very similar to those faced by the descendants of Sogdians in Chang'an. The Silk Road was exceptionally good at creating people like this. They were not merely bridges between East and West. They were in themselves places where 2 or more worlds overlapped. A day in the harbor begins with the tide. When a ship enters port, pilots and dock workers are among the first people to become busy. A large seagoing vessel cannot simply approach the shore at random. It needs someone who understands depth, currents, and tides to guide it in. Once the cargo is unloaded, customs collection and market administration begin. Spices were among the most characteristic commodities of maritime trade. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, agarwood, frankincense, and many other products came from different regions. They were valuable, relatively compact, and well suited to ocean commerce. Some were used in cooking, some in medicine, and others in religious ceremonies or as incense. The value of a spice often came from scarcity. The less a place could produce a particular flavor itself, the more expensive that distant taste became. For an urban resident of Song, China, a small handful of spies from a remote island might already have passed through several maritime exchanges. The merchant selling it might not know the tree on which it originally grew. He only knew that the market would pay a high price. Ceramics were different. Their value per piece might be lower than that of spices, but demand was large, and ships could carry them in enormous quantities. That created a close relationship between kilns and ports. Imagine a kiln complex in Fujian or Jiangxi. Clay is selected and processed, then thrown on a wheel or pressed into molds. The vessels are dried, glazed, and loaded into a kiln. Firing demands experience. A slight problem with temperature can ruin much of an entire load. When the kiln is opened, the craftsman does not first think about international cultural exchange. He checks the yield, which bowl warped, which plate has the wrong glaze color, which batch can command the best price. The successful pieces are packed and moved by river, road, or coastal transport toward the port. Packing ceramics is a technology in itself. A ship rolls and pitches. Cargo stacks press against one another. If bowls are simply piled loosely, they may reach the destination as nothing but shards. Merchants used straw, timber, and other materials to reduce impact and could nest vessels inside one another to save space. A ship carried more than ceramics. Different cargo required different positions in the hold. Anything vulnerable to water could not be placed where leaks were likely. Heavy goods affected the balance of the vessel. Load a ship badly, and a storm could endanger everyone aboard. Maritime commerce therefore tied business closely to engineering. A captain had to understand money. He also had to understand ships. Leaving Quanzhou, vessels sailed south into the South China Sea. Ports along the coast provided fresh water and supplies. In Southeast Asia, the world became multilingual all over again. The regions we now call Vietnam, Thailand, the Malay Peninsula, and the Indonesian archipelago contained many important ports and political powers at different times. The Strait of Malacca would later become an especially critical choke point, but in earlier periods, other straits and ports in the surrounding region were equally important. Sea routes were not forced through mountain passes in the same way as overland roads, but they were still constrained by geography. Ships needed shelter harbors. They needed fresh water. They had to avoid dangerous shoals. They had to use the wind. So maritime routes also produced node cities. And the fate of a port city could resemble the fate of an oasis kingdom. If the route passed through, the city prospered. If the route shifted, it declined. One faced the desert, the other faced the sea. Continuing west from Southeast Asia, ships entered the Indian Ocean. Ports around the Indian subcontinent had long served as centers of international trade. India produced cotton textiles, spices, gemstones, and other commodities, while also functioning as a vast transfer zone between eastern and western maritime routes. The importance of cotton cloth in Indian Ocean trade is often hidden by the name Silk Road. Many ordinary consumers could not afford expensive silk, but everyone needed cloth. Indian cotton textiles circulated widely in many periods, demonstrating that long-distance trade was not always reserved for luxury goods. Once the cost of maritime transport fell, everyday goods could travel farther too. That was a profound change. Early long-distance land routes favored goods that were expensive and light. Mature maritime systems could pull ever larger volumes of ordinary commodities into international trade. From India, ships could continue west toward the Persian Gulf or across the Arabian Sea toward the Red Sea. Dense networks linked the ports. West Asian merchants had long participated in Indian Ocean commerce, connecting its goods onward to the Mediterranean world. Sail farther south, and the same maritime network could reach East Africa. Swahili cities along the East African coast participated in Indian Ocean trade, exporting goods such as ivory and gold while importing ceramics, textiles, and other products. Fragments of Chinese ceramics found at East African archaeological sites are among the physical traces of those connections. A Chinese bowl reaching Africa does not mean a Chinese merchant personally carried it there. Again, it was a relay, always a relay. That may be the single best word for the entire story of the Silk Road. Overland trade was a relay. Maritime trade was a relay. Information moved by relay. Religions moved by relay. Technologies moved by relay. No civilization completed the entire process alone. Life at sea also carried a psychological pressure that overland travelers did not experience in quite the same way. If you're lost in a desert, at least you know there is ground beneath your feet. At sea, after days without sight of land, your sense of space can begin to disappear. By day, there's only water. By night, only stars. Even while sleeping, sailors hear the timbers creak. When a wind rises, the hull tilts again and again. New crew members become seasick and cannot eat. Fresh water stored in containers grows stale. Rats and insects get into the food, and one of the most frightening things is no wind at all. A storm at least gives everyone something to do. In a dead calm, the ship seems nailed to the surface of the sea. The sails hang limp. The sun beats down. Fresh water declines day by day. At that moment, what the crew wants to see is not gold. It is wind. Maritime merchants learned to respect the seasons. They knew that people could not command the ocean. They could only use the windows the ocean allowed. During the Song and Yuan periods, the expansion of trade between China and the Indian Ocean brought ports, such as Quanzhou, to a peak of prosperity. UNESCO research on Quanzhou's Songyuan heritage emphasizes that the city was not simply a harbor. It was an entire system combining production, transport, markets, religion, and administration. That distinction matters. A successful port is never just a place with docks. Roads must bring goods in from the hinterland. There must be bridges, warehouses, customs institutions, markets, shipyards, religious and community spaces for foreign merchants who remain in the city for long periods. Financial and credit relationships. In this respect, the maritime network was exactly like the overland Silk Road. A great trade route eventually becomes infrastructure. A road does not remain only a road. It grows cities, and cities in turn protect and amplify trade. That feedback loop is what allows a route to endure for centuries. Why did maritime trade become especially prosperous during the Song period? One important reason was that the center of China's economy was shifting increasingly toward the south. Populations grew in the Jiangnan region and along the southeastern coast. Handicraft industries flourished. Ceramics, silk textiles, and many other goods were produced in large quantities. At the same time, the Indian Ocean trading system was already highly developed. Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants knew the routes, and long-standing connections linked the ports. Chinese merchants were not entering an empty ocean. They were joining an international commercial system that was already running. That reminds us once again that the so-called Maritime Silk Road was not built by any one civilization. It was more like an enormous chain. Quanzhou was linked to the ports of Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia was linked to India. The Western Indian Ocean connected to the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, and East Africa. Every stretch of sea had sailors who understood its local monsoons and harbors. Every port had its own merchant communities. At sea, goods moved by relay too. A Chinese ceramic vessel did not need to sail directly from Quanzhou to East Africa on a single ship. It could change ships in Southeast Asia, be sold again in India, and then be carried by another group of merchants into the Arabian Sea or along the East African coast. Fragments of Chinese ceramics found by archaeologists at sites in Southeast Asia, West Asia, and East Africa are evidence of this complex system of exchange. A broken piece of pottery looks ordinary, but when it is excavated at an ancient port thousands of kilometers from China, it suddenly becomes meaningful. Ceramics cannot travel by themselves. If a Chinese bowl appears there, someone must have packed it, someone must have sailed with it, someone must have bought it, and someone must have used it. Perhaps it was once a beautiful bowl used by a family for decades before it broke. Or perhaps the ship carrying it sank, and the bowl did not see daylight again for centuries. Remains of Song and Yuan-era ships and harbor facilities found near Quanzhou give us a more concrete picture of this trade. Large ocean-going vessels needed strong hulls, well-designed compartments, and enough space to store supplies for long voyages. Chinese maritime technology continued to develop during this period, and the compass gradually became part of practical navigation at sea. But we should not reduce the history of ocean travel to a simple story. The compass was invented, so people suddenly dared to sail. Long before compasses were widely used, Indian Ocean sailors had navigated for generations using stars, monsoon winds, currents, and accumulated experience. The compass was a new tool added to an older knowledge system. It did not create maritime trade from nothing. A truly skilled captain never trusted only one instrument. He watched the sky, the clouds, the color of the water, the birds, the wind, near land. Experienced sailors might even estimate their position from sediment in the water, floating seaweed, smells carried from shore, or the shape of coastal mountains. This kind of knowledge rarely appears in grand historical chronicles. It passed from master to apprentice, from father to son, tested again and again on actual voyages. The people who made fatal mistakes might never return. The knowledge that proved reliable survived. So the knowledge transmitted along the Silk Roads was not limited to famous technologies such as papermaking, gunpowder, printing, and the compass. More often, what traveled were small pieces of practical experience. How to keep grapevines alive, how to make better glass, how to treat an injured camel, how to process a particular spice, how to navigate by the stars, how to write a foreign name using the sounds and characters of your own language. Taken together, these small transfers are what real exchange between civilizations looks like. The spread of paper is a good example. China developed mature paper-making technology relatively early. Over time, paper spread into Central Asia and farther west. A popular story says that after the Battle of Talas in 751, captured Chinese artisans introduced paper-making to Samarkand. Modern scholarship, however, reminds us that technological transmission is rarely that simple. Paper was already present in Central Asia before the battle. Captured artisans may have helped stimulate or accelerate local production, but they were unlikely to have been the only source. That version is less dramatic than the legend, but it is probably closer to how history actually works. Technologies rarely cross continents because of one person and one dramatic moment. They spread gradually through the movement of craftspeople, commercial demand, access to raw materials, and long periods of imitation and adaptation. After paper became widely used in the Islamic world, it supported writing, administration, and the preservation of knowledge. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, cities such as Baghdad became major centers of scholarship and translation. Scholars translated, organized, and developed knowledge inherited from Greek, Persian, Indian, and other traditions. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy all produced new achievements there, and those ideas later traveled into other regions by many different routes. If we understand the Silk Road only as Eastern goods moving west, we miss all of this. Knowledge never moved in only one direction. The Indian numeral system was developed and transmitted through Arabic-speaking scholars and later had a profound impact on European mathematics. Astronomical and medical traditions from Central and West Asia entered East Asia through exchange. Chinese paper and printing technologies gradually spread outward. Persian and Central Asian forms in metalwork, textile patterns, and decorative art influenced China and regions even farther east. Some of these changes could be hidden in something as small as a piece of clothing. Tang art preserves Central and West Asian styles of dress, vessels, and ornament. Decorative motifs common in Sasanian Persian art, including pearl roundels and paired animal designs, traveled through textiles, metalwork, and other media into Central Asia, East Asia, and even Japan. A pattern does not need a voice in order to travel thousands of kilometers. Music needs even less translation. The extraordinary richness of music and dance in Tang Chang'an was closely connected to exchange with Central Asia. Traditions associated with Kutcha, Gaochang, Quanzhou, and other regions entered the court and popular entertainment. Poets wrote about foreign dancers, grape wine, the pipa, and frontier landscapes, not because the Tangs suddenly developed an abstract fascination with exoticism, but because these things were physically present in the cities where they lived. Let's return once more to a day in Chang'an. The market opens in the morning. A merchant enters a shop looking for spices from Central Asia. Nearby, someone sells grape wine. Farther down the street, someone displays gold and silver vessels. A rider passes in narrow-sleeved clothing suited to horseback travel. Someone leads a horse from the western regions. Music drifts out of a wine shop. If our merchant was born in Chang'an, he may not find any of this especially foreign. That is the deepest stage of cultural exchange. Not when everyone stares at something new in amazement, but when everyone has grown used to it. Habit is history's quietest and most enduring victory. But the Silk Road brought more than beautiful things. If goods, knowledge, and people can move, diseases can move as well. Ancient long-distance trade networks increased contact between distant populations, and that also created opportunities for infectious disease to travel along commercial roads and sea lanes. The precise origins and pathways of the 14th century Black Death have been studied for generations. Recent ancient DNA evidence points to an important origin in Central Asia, after which plague spread west through complex movements of people and trade. Shipping through the Black Sea and Mediterranean played an important part in its wider transmission. This reminds us that connection itself has no morality. A road does not choose to carry only good fortune. It can carry Buddhist scriptures and pathogens. It can carry wealth and news of war. It can help strangers cooperate and allow armies to move farther. The Silk Road is most real when we accept both sides of that history. In the 13th century, Eurasia underwent another enormous political transformation. The Mongol period occupies a special place in Silk Road history because, for a time, routes that had previously belonged to many separate political worlds came under systems of rule that were connected to one another. But before we look at the map, let us look at a messenger. Imagine an envoy ordered to travel from Central Asia to a Mongol court farther east. What he needs most is not the fastest horse in the world. He needs a system that lets him keep changing horses. Even the finest horse gets tired. A human can press onward by changing mounts. An animal cannot. Mongol rulers expanded and made extensive use of relay station networks, allowing official information to move rapidly through frequent changes of horses and regular resupply. Stations provided mounts, food, and temporary lodging, and envoys carrying the proper credentials could claim those services. The Mongols did not invent this system from nothing. China, Central Asia, and earlier steppe polities had all used different forms of postal and relay administration. What made the Mongol system distinctive was the extraordinary geographical scale over which it was applied. Information began to move faster. Orders from rulers, military reports, diplomatic documents, tax records, and, inevitably, news merchants heard about changing prices. Once roads serve an empire, they rarely serve only the empire. Merchants use them. Religious travelers use them. Other travelers follow the same nodes. In the 13th century, European envoys truly did reach the political centers of the Mongol world. Papal emissaries, such as John of Plano Carpini and William of Rubruck, left detailed travel accounts. To them, The steppe was no longer simply the edge of the world. It was a completely different political order. Rubruk encountered people from many regions during his journey. Those encounters capture something essential about Eurasia under Mongol rule. A French friar at a steppe court might meet Central Asians, West Asians, Russians, Armenians, and even craftspeople from regions of China. Imperial conquest also caused forced migration. Artisans, technicians, and specialists from conquered territories could be relocated to serve rulers elsewhere. Today, we often imagine technological exchange as a teacher voluntarily traveling abroad to share knowledge. Historically, many transfers were far less gentle. War moved people. People moved technology. It was a brutal but very real mechanism of diffusion. Different religions also occupied a complicated space under Mongol rule. In many periods, Mongol rulers took a pragmatic approach toward Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, traditional shamanic practices, and other beliefs. Religious specialists from different traditions could appear at the same court, praying for rulers, debating one another, or competing for patronage. That did not amount to religious freedom in the modern sense. It was, above all, a method of imperial management. Mongol rulers governed too many peoples and too many faiths for forced immediate conversion to a single religion to be practical. Tolerating difference was often simply more efficient. That political reality unintentionally encouraged the movement of people. Merchants value predictable order above almost everything else. They do not require rulers to be kind. They need to know what tax must be paid, which document must be carried, and where their cargo will not be arbitrarily confiscated. If relatively stable rules operate across several regions, the cost of long-distance trade falls. Mongol rulers also worked directly with merchants, using commercial partnerships to raise funds and obtain luxury goods. Central Asian merchants were especially active in these arrangements. Old Silk Road routes experienced a new period of prosperity, but we should not imagine an uninterrupted, perfectly safe highway from Beijing to Europe. The Mongol Empire soon divided into separate khanates. Those khanates fought one another. Local politics remained complicated, so the greater ease of transcontinental movement was relative, not absolute. What matters is that the 13th century produced an unprecedented psychological change across Eurasia. More people understood that extremely distant places could actually be reached. That changes imagination. The enormous influence of Marco Polo's story belongs to this world. His book sparked intense European interest in the cities and wealth of Asia, but modern readers should approach it with some caution. A medieval travel book was not a modern reporter's live dispatch. The traveler might dictate his story. Scribes could alter it. Different manuscript versions could contain different material. Some stories came from personal observation. Others may have come from secondhand reports. The safest approach, therefore, is neither to treat every sentence as unquestionable proof nor to declare the entire work fictional because some details are disputed. A better way to read it is as a window into how information about Asia entered Europe in the 13th century. A reader opening the travels of Marco Polo and encountering descriptions of paper money, salt, relay stations, enormous cities, and Asian wealth would be forced to recognize that a highly complex world existed beyond Europe. The book later influenced many geographical imaginations. Christopher Columbus owned texts associated with Marco Polo and left annotations in them. It would be far too simple to say that Columbus sailed west merely because he had read Marco Polo. But the long-standing European imagination of Eastern wealth certainly formed part of the intellectual world that encouraged exploration. That is the power of stories. A bolt of silk can change a market. A book can change an imagination. And imagination can change the reasons later people choose to sail. The Mongol period also brings another important group into focus, one often overlooked in grand narratives. Craftspeople. A large empire needs weapons, buildings, textiles, metalwork, astronomical instruments, medicine, and administrative technologies. When craftspeople were relocated or chose to move to new cities, they carried their skills with them. A craftsperson is different from a merchant. A merchant sells a finished product. A craftsperson can reproduce the ability to make that product in a new place. That is why the decisive moment in technological diffusion is often not when an object arrives. It is when the person who knows how to make the object arrives. One glass cup sold in China changes the experience of one buyer. One glassmaker who settles in China and trains 10 apprentices can change an industry. Likewise, one sheet of paper reaching Central Asia can only be used. A papermaker who teaches local people how to produce, it can change a society. Silk Road transmission, therefore, happened on 3 levels. The first was objects. The second was knowledge. The third was people who knew how to use that knowledge. The third was the most powerful. During the 13th and early 14th centuries, increased movement across Eurasia also encouraged important exchanges in astronomy. Astronomers and instrument traditions from the Islamic world appeared at the Yuan court, while Chinese astronomy attracted attention from scholars farther west. Calendrical systems, methods of observation, and mathematical knowledge came into contact because empires needed them. This kind of exchange cannot be packed into a crate like silk, yet it can shape the history of knowledge for centuries. Medicine moved in the same way. When a ruler was ill, he did not care which civilization the doctor came from. He cared whether the doctor could help. Practical need can push knowledge across cultural prejudice. In great cities, doctors, medicines, and medical texts could move alongside commerce. Spices from distant regions were not only luxuries, they could also be drugs. Many ancient commodities are difficult to divide neatly into categories such as food, medicine, and spice because their uses overlapped. Pepper could season food. It could also be used medicinally. Frankincense could serve religious rituals. It could also be used in medicine and perfumery. Silk Road markets were places where this kind of multi-purpose knowledge changed hands. But the tighter the connections became, the farther risks could travel as well. The Great Plague pandemic of the mid-14th century reminded Eurasia that transport networks could carry death as efficiently as wealth. Modern ancient DNA research links an important source of the 14th century pandemic to the Tian Shan region of Central Asia. The exact pathways by which the disease then spread across different regions still have to be reconstructed from multiple kinds of evidence, but trade and population movement clearly provided routes of transmission. Once plague entered the Black Sea commercial network and reached the Mediterranean world, Europe suffered a demographic catastrophe. We do not need to stay with this subject for long. This is not a history of pandemics. Just remember one image. A merchant ship enters port. There is cargo on board, and there are pathogens no one could see. Dock workers unload the crates. The city continues trading as usual. A few weeks later, everything has changed. History can work like that. On the first day, the largest events can look like nothing at all. Plague did not choose the Silk Road. It simply exploited the connections humans had already built. And so every age of globalization raises the same question. How does connection make people richer? And how does it allow risk to travel farther? Ancient societies did not have modern epidemiology, but they responded with isolation, flight from cities, religious rituals, and many traditional practices. The more systematic quarantine measures later developed in Mediterranean ports were part of this long history of learning from repeated disaster. The Silk Road, therefore, transmitted another kind of knowledge as well: how to live with the risks created by connection. By the second half of the 14th century, the political landscape of the Mongol Khanates had fragmented further, and the earlier sense of a connected transcontinental political space weakened. But Central Asia did not fall silent. Under Timur and his successors, Samarkand again became a major political and cultural center. By then, however, this was no longer the Samarkand of the early Sogdians. Its religion, languages, and architecture had changed profoundly. The famous tradition of monumental blue architecture reached extraordinary heights under the Timurids and their successors. If a 7th century Sogdian merchant were somehow transported into 15th century Samarkand, he might recognize the mountains and the river valley. He might not recognize his city. That is one of the most astonishing things about 1,000 years of Silk Road history. The road seemed not to have moved. The human world has changed several times over. Under Chinggis Khan and his successors, Mongol peoples expanded across Eurasia and built an imperial system of unprecedented scale. The conquests were extraordinarily violent. Many cities were destroyed, and populations suffered devastating losses. That reality must not be hidden behind later stories of easier travel and trade. But history often holds apparently contradictory truths at the same time. After the destruction of conquest, the Mongol Khanates also established relay stations, transport systems, and political connections across vast regions. During some periods, merchants, envoys, religious figures, and travelers found it easier to cross Eurasia than they had in earlier centuries. Later historians often use the term Pax Mongolica or Mongol peace to describe this phenomenon, but the phrase can obscure the military conquest that made it possible. It is more accurate to say that Mongol rule created, for a time, a relatively connected transcontinental political space. The roads became active again. Relay stations supplied horses and provisions to official messengers. Rulers also took a close interest in commerce. Mongol elites needed tax revenue, skilled artisans, technologies, and luxury goods, so they encouraged many merchants to operate across regions. Central Asian traders, West Asian merchants, European travelers, and people from many parts of China all moved through this network. The 13th century Eurasian world therefore produced encounters that would once have been difficult to imagine. European Franciscan friars traveled to Mongol courts. Envoys from Armenia, Persia, and Central Asia moved east. Astronomers, physicians, and craftspeople from West Asia worked in Mongol-ruled territories. Technicians from China and Central Asia were relocated across enormous distances. The people on the road were no longer only merchants. The empire itself was moving populations. This mixture of forced and voluntary migration accelerated technological diffusion. The westward movement of gunpowder technology is one phenomenon worth watching in this period. China developed gunpowder and early gunpowder weapons relatively early, after which different Eurasian powers continued learning, experimenting, and improving through war and exchange. There is no need to compress the story into a neat line, such as China invented it, Arabs passed it on, Europe copied it. The real process looked more like repeated borrowing, testing, and adaptation among multiple regions. When a technology arrives somewhere new, it rarely remains unchanged. It is, in a sense, invented again. The most famous east-west travel story of the 13th century is, of course, Marco Polo. According to the traditional account in the Travels of Marco Polo, the young Marco left Venice with his father and uncle in 1271. Passed through West and Central Asia, and traveled in the lands ruled by the Mongols in the east. Scholars have debated many details of his route and experiences for a long time, but there is no doubt that the book had an enormous effect on European ideas about Asia. Marco Polo's importance is not simply that he went to China. More important is that his book allowed many readers who had never left Europe to encounter, in words, an enormous, wealthy, and unfamiliar Asian world. Paper money, great cities, relay stations, salt production, harbors, the Mongol court. Some descriptions were accurate. Some were exaggerated. Some were shaped by oral retelling and manuscript transmission. Together, however, they created one powerful impression. The East was not a mythical edge of the world. It contained complete societies, markets, and urban life. A book became another kind of Silk Road commodity. What it carried was imagination. At almost the same time, travelers from other cultural traditions were also recording the wider world. In the 14th century, the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta journeyed across North Africa, West Asia, South Asia, and other regions, describing the Indian Ocean world and places he said he reached in China. The accounts of different travelers do not always agree, but taken together they reveal just how interconnected Eurasia and the Indian Ocean had become in the 13th and 14th centuries. A merchant sailing from Quanzhou did not need to know where Venice was. A Venetian merchant trading around the Black Sea did not need to know Chang'an. Yet they lived inside the same connected economic world. A shift in demand at one end could, after several exchanges, affect the other. That is one of the most astonishing features of long-distance networks. They allow people who never meet to influence one another. Song, in Yuan-era Quanzhou, is one of the best places from which to observe that world. Behind the port stretched inland production zones. Ceramics moved from kilns into river and road networks before reaching the harbor. Silk textiles, metal goods, tea, and other products converged there from different regions. Spices, medicines, jewels, and other imports arrived from overseas and moved inland into Chinese markets. The port functioned like a giant lung. The tides brought ships in and carried them out again. The city breathed with trade. Imagine choosing an ordinary dock worker as our observer. He may never leave Quanzhou in his entire life. Yet every day he handles goods that have traveled thousands of kilometers. He may not know which island produces agarwood. He may not know how far a Persian glass bottle has traveled. He may not even know that later historians will say he participated in something called the Maritime Silk Road. But this is how history is made. The people actually living through history usually do not know what later generations will call their age. That is also why the term Silk Road did not appear until the 19th century. An ancient merchant did not say, "I am working on the Silk Road today." He said, "I'm going to Dunhuang. I'm going to Samarkand. I'm going to Quanzhou. When the monsoon changes, I am sailing to India." Only later did historians connect countless individual destinations and recognize the enormous network behind them. After the Mongol Empire fragmented, transcontinental movement did not suddenly stop, but political conditions continued to change. New states emerged in Central Asia, West Asia, and Eastern Europe, and merchants faced new frontiers, taxes, and wars. The Great Plague pandemic of the 14th century also dealt a severe blow to populations and trade across Eurasia. Even so, commerce by land and sea continued. The real transformation of the Silk Road was not that someone closed it on a particular day. It was that from the 15th century onward, global oceanic networks began to reshape the economics of long-distance trade. That transition needs to be told carefully. From a European perspective, Eastern spices, silk, and other luxuries had long reached European markets through interconnected Mediterranean, West Asian, and Indian Ocean systems. There were many intermediaries, and prices could be high. Over time, finding new sea routes that could reach the Indian Ocean and Asian markets more directly became an important goal for some European maritime states. In 1498, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama rounded the southern tip of Africa and reached India. But this was not simply a case of the Silk Road closed, so Europeans were forced to sail. That popular explanation is far too simple. European maritime expansion was driven by a combination of navigational technology, competition among states, commercial profit, religion, and strategic ambition. Nor did Ottoman control of Constantinople completely cut off east-west trade. Venice and other Mediterranean commercial powers continued to trade with Eastern networks for a long time. What really changed the world was something else. European fleets entered the Indian Ocean directly. For thousands of years, these waters have been shaped primarily by many Asian, Arab, and East African trading communities. Now European states entered with armed ships, and the nature of commercial competition began to change. Long-distance trade increasingly relied on transoceanic routes. A single ship could now bypass many overland nodes. For traditional caravan cities, that was a gradual but profound change. Imagine an inn beside an old Central Asian route. When a grandfather was young, camel caravans arrived every day. In the father's generation, there were fewer. By the time the son inherited the inn, perhaps only a dozen travelers appeared over the course of an entire day. The well was still there. The building was still there. The road had not disappeared. There were simply fewer people. That is what the decline of many historical routes really looks like. Not a door slammed shut overnight, just a little more silence each year. At the same time, China's maritime activity followed its own changing path. In the early Ming period, the fleets of Zhang He made repeated voyages across the Indian Ocean, visiting Southeast Asia, South Asia, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and parts of East Africa. These enormous expeditions primarily served state diplomacy, the tributary system, and official exchange, while also carrying commercial activity. After the Zhang He voyages ended, large-scale state expeditions declined, but that did not mean China's overseas trade disappeared. Ming maritime restrictions tightened and loosened at different times, while private seaborne commerce continued in many forms. From the 16th century onward, official policies also shifted, and private trade along the southeastern coast became increasingly active. Chinese goods continued to enter global markets, especially porcelain and silk. By this point, it becomes difficult to imagine the world through the old, traditional image of the Silk Road. Trade networks had become genuinely global. Chinese porcelain could be carried by European ships into the Atlantic world. Silver from the Americas flowed into Asian markets. The Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and Atlantic Ocean were increasingly connected within a single commercial system. Camel caravans still crossed Central Asia, but they no longer carried the entire imaginative weight of east-west long-distance trade. The Silk Road did not die. It simply lost center stage. And some Silk Road cities did not disappear just because international trade patterns changed. Samarkand remained an important Central Asian city. Kashgar remained a regional commercial center. People continued to live in Dunhuang. Xuanzhou continued as a city. When the function of a route changes, cities find new ways to survive. History rarely clears the stage completely. The actors change. The plot changes. Much of the old scenery remains. After the 15th century, changing world trade was not simply a matter of one old route being replaced by one new route. It was more like the map suddenly zoomed out. For centuries, long-distance Eurasian trade had largely revolved around connections among overland routes, the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. In the age of exploration, European fleets rounded southern Africa and entered the Indian Ocean, then continued into Southeast and East Asia. Soon, Atlantic and Pacific commerce were being drawn into the same system. The world began to function more like a single market. Silk still mattered. Porcelain still mattered. Spices still mattered. But the routes by which they moved were changing. A crate of porcelain could be loaded directly onto an ocean-going sailing ship, carried around the Cape of Good Hope, and delivered to Europe. Chinese silk could also move overseas in much larger quantities. Central Asian caravans continued to operate, but they were no longer the unavoidable trunk route of all east-west commerce. Traditional overland nodes, therefore, faced new competition, not simply because ships were somehow more advanced. The key difference was cost. If the cargo is a small pouch of gemstones, overland transport may still have an advantage. If the cargo is 50 tons of porcelain, camels have a much harder time competing with a ship. A single vessel can carry what might otherwise require hundreds or even thousands of pack animals. Sea transport changes the scale of trade. Scale changes price. Price changes consumption. Imported goods, once affordable only to elites, can, as supply expands, gradually enter the lives of much broader groups of people. That is one of the deepest social changes created by global trade. It is not simply that the world gains more luxury goods. It is that some things once considered extraordinary luxuries slowly become ordinary. Tea's later history in Europe is a good example. It first arrived as an unfamiliar Asian drink, expensive and strongly associated with status. As imports increased and habits of consumption spread, tea gradually entered everyday life across a much wider part of society. The global tea trade, however, belongs mainly to the early modern maritime world and lies beyond the core period of the ancient Silk Roads. For our story, we only need to see one thing. The cross-cultural habits of consumption cultivated by the Silk Roads did not disappear. Human beings had learned to desire things from far away. As long as that desire exists, routes will keep reappearing in new forms. The voyages of Zhang Qian in the early 15th century are among the most striking events in East Asian maritime history. During the reign of the Yongle Emperor, Zhang Qian led large fleets on repeated expeditions into the Western Oceans, sailing through Southeast Asia and South Asia and reaching the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, and parts of East Africa. Historical sources preserve substantial information about the fleets, their personnel, and their diplomatic activity. The exact dimensions of the famous treasure ships, however, remain debated, so there is no need to rely on extreme numbers simply to create a sense of spectacle. The real scale was already astonishing enough. Imagine a fleet composed of dozens, perhaps more than 100 vessels serving different purposes. Alongside the principal ships were transports, supply vessels, and other craft. The people on board were not only sailors. There were interpreters, physicians, officials, soldiers, and specialists of many kinds. A fleet like this entering a foreign harbor was, in effect, a moving city. Zhang He's voyages were primarily state-directed diplomatic and political missions of the Ming Dynasty, though trade and exchanges of goods accompanied them. They were fundamentally different from private merchant voyages driven primarily by profit. That distinction matters. A state fleet can absorb costs that an ordinary merchant cannot. A merchant who loses money 3 voyages in a row may go bankrupt. A government may continue spending because the voyage serves diplomatic goals. So the extraordinary scale of Zhang He's expeditions should not be treated as a complete picture of Chinese private maritime commerce. When large official expeditions declined, merchants along China's southeastern coast did not collectively stop going to sea. Private maritime trade continued, and as the global silver trade expanded in the 16th century, East Asian seaborne commerce entered a new phase. More European powers were now entering Asian waters. The Portuguese established trading bases across parts of the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. The Spanish later used the Philippines to connect American silver with Asian markets. Dutch and English maritime commercial powers followed. Competition became increasingly militarized. Merchant ships often appeared alongside armed force. Control of ports, sea lanes, and trade monopolies became part of competition between states. This marked a clear change from older Silk Road systems that depended heavily on relay trade through intermediaries. For an earlier merchant, one of the most important skills was learning how to enter a market controlled by someone else. Some early modern European states and chartered companies increasingly tried to control the market themselves. Those are very different commercial logics. But there is no need to tell the story as though one side simply replaced another. Existing Indian Ocean merchants did not vanish overnight. Arab, Indian, Southeast Asian, and Chinese merchants remained active. European powers forced their way into an already crowded system and expanded their influence over the following centuries. World trade became more complicated. It did not suddenly become the possession of one side alone. By the 16th and 17th centuries, global commodity flows were creating combinations that would once have been difficult to imagine. Silver mined in the Americas flowed into Asian markets by routes across both the Pacific and Europe. Asian silk, porcelain, and spices moved toward Europe and the Americas. Some European manufactured goods entered Asian markets. Africa was drawn ever more deeply into an expanding global system as well. That is another enormously complex history filled with warfare, colonialism, and forced labor. For the story of the Silk Roads, we only need to note the result. The old Eurasian routes were no longer the world's only commercial skeleton. The oceans became the new main stage. Many traditional Silk Road cities, therefore, adjusted their roles. Some remained prosperous as regional markets. Some gradually declined. Some rose again because a new political center gave them new importance. The history of a road is never a simple sequence of birth, prosperity, and death. It is more like a human life. It grows one way in childhood, reaches a peak in adulthood. Then the environment changes, and survival requires learning new ways to live. By the early modern period, the Silk Roads had entered that stage. They still existed, but they were no longer what they had once been. The change even altered the meaning of distance. In the ancient world, a letter sent from Samarkand to Dunhuang might take months. In the age of mature oceanic commerce, a voyage from Asia to Europe still took a very long time, but one ship could carry a volume of cargo unimaginable to an old camel caravan. Later, steamships reduced travel time further. When railways began to cross Eurasia, traditional camel routes became even more marginal as systems of transport. By then, we have entered the modern age, and our real question is no longer how modern states use the word Silk Road. It is what the ancient roads left behind. The answer is buried in everyday life. The histories of many things that once traveled across cultures have already been forgotten. A musical instrument, a fruit, a piece of cloth, a number, a sheet of paper, a religious image, an architectural motif. When each first crossed a border, it may have seemed deeply foreign. Today, a society may regard it as part of its own tradition. That is one of culture's most interesting paradoxes. Many things we call traditional are actually products of ancient globalization. People borrow, adapt, forget that they borrowed, and eventually call the result their own. There is nothing shameful in that process. It is evidence that a civilization is alive. A culture completely untouched by outside influence has almost never existed. As long as people travel, they exchange. As long as they exchange, they change. From the 19th century onward, the growth of archaeology, linguistics, and geographical research turned the ancient Silk Roads into an increasingly important subject of scholarship. Researchers began comparing Chinese historical records with Greek and Roman texts, Persian and Arabic sources, documents in Central Asian languages, and archaeological finds. The same historical event can look completely different depending on the direction from which we approach it. The Dayuan of Chinese chronicles has to be matched against Central Asian geography. When Roman writers mention this series, we have to ask how much they really knew about the East. Sogdian documents reveal a commercial world quite unlike the one described in official dynastic histories. The hardest and most fascinating part of studying the Silk Roads is that we have to listen to many voices at once. If we read only one country's official histories, the Silk Road becomes that country's frontier story. If we read only European travelers, it becomes a story about discovering the East. If we read only merchants, it becomes a history of profit. If we read only religious sources, it becomes a history of transmission. Put all the evidence together, and one thing becomes clear. No single viewpoint is large enough. The Silk Roads were larger than any empire. Empires disappear. Roads are reused by the next people who come along. After the Han Dynasty was gone, merchants kept traveling. After the Kushans declined, Buddhism and trade continued to change. After the Sasanian Empire fell, commerce in West Asia did not disappear. After the Tang ended, people still lived in Dunhuang and the cities of Central Asia. After the Mongol Empire fragmented, long-distance trade continued. The most durable force was never any particular ruler. It was human need. The need for horses, salt, cloth, spices, scriptures, medicine, income, news from far away. Those needs do not end when a dynasty changes. So roads are always walked into existence again. In the 19th century, European geographers and explorers turned renewed attention toward the interior of Eurasia. The German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen used the term Silk Roads to describe ancient connections between China, Central Asia, and the West. The name spread and eventually became the historical concept familiar around the world today. There's an irony in that. By the time the Silk Road received its name, its greatest ancient ages were already long past. It was as though a river had been flowing for centuries before anyone drew it on a map and gave the whole thing a single name. From the late 19th into the early 20th century, archaeological expeditions and exploration in Central Asia and northwestern China brought large numbers of ruins, murals, and manuscripts into international scholarship. Discoveries at Dunhuang, Lulan, Naya, Gaochang, and other sites made the Silk Road, once known largely through written histories, something people could physically touch. And what they found was far more complicated than the legend. There were Buddhist scriptures, and there were IOUs. There were exquisite murals, and there was garbage. There were imperial orders, and there were angry letters from wives waiting for husbands who had not come home. There was priceless silk, and there were the worn-out shoes of ordinary people. That is the wonder of archaeology. Again and again, it turns big history back into small, lived experience. A shoe tells us the size of an ancient person's foot. A grape seed tells us what people ate. A contract tells us who owed money to whom. A letter tells us that someone was waiting for a person who was very late coming home. Taken together, these things transform the Silk Road from lines on a map into a world where people actually lived. So if we ask our opening question one more time, how could a bolt of silk travel from Chang'an to the Mediterranean? We can finally answer it. First, it depended on producers, the people who grew mulberry trees, the people who raised silkworms, the people who reeled the silk, the weavers, the dyers. After it left the loom, a merchant had to buy it. Porters had to load it. Camels or carts had to carry it. In the Hushi corridor, it depended on towns and water. Beyond Dunhuang, it depended on guides who knew where the oases were. In the Darim Basin, it depended on local merchants and interpreters. Crossing mountain country required people who knew high-altitude routes. In Central Asia, it might enter the networks of Sogdians or other commercial communities. Farther west, it depended on countless intermediaries in Parthian, Persian, Mesopotamian, and Mediterranean markets. Any one link in that chain might have no idea who the next link would be. And yet the goods arrived. That is the power of a network. It does not require everyone to trust everyone else. It only requires enough trust between each pair of links. A merchant in Dunhuang did not need to know the buyer in Rome. He only needed to believe someone at the next stop would buy his goods. That person, in turn, only needed to believe there would be another market farther on. Small pockets of local trust added up to movement across an entire continent. The same principle applies to ideas. An Indian monk did not need to imagine a Japanese temple centuries in the future. He only needed to teach the scripture to the people around him. They passed it to the next group. A melody, a decorative pattern, a technology, a food, all traveled farther in the same way. Perhaps the greatest achievement of the Silk Roads was not that they connected east and west. That phrase is too neat, as though the world had only two endpoints. What the Silk Roads really connected were countless regions in between, and it was in those middle spaces that culture was most likely to change. Samarkand was not merely a corridor between China and Rome. It had a history of its own. Kutcha was not merely a transfer station carrying Buddhism from India to China. It created its own art and music. Dunhuang was not merely a gateway from Chang'an into the western regions. It was a complex society in its own right. Quanzhou was not merely the harbor from which Chinese goods went overseas. It was a city shaped together by local residents and people who came from abroad. Only when we stop staring at the two ends of the road does the Silk Road truly come alive. And perhaps the people most worth remembering are not even the famous ones. Zhang Qian mattered. Faxian and Xuanzang mattered. Marco Polo's story had enormous influence. But no road lasting more than 1,000 years could have been sustained by a handful of famous names. It existed because of people whose names were never recorded. The person saddling a camel before dawn. The person searching for water in the desert. The money changer calculating exchange rates over and over in a market. The sailor sealing a leak in the hold. The copyist working on a scripture late into the night. The innkeeper cooking a hot meal for a stranger. The person waiting for a letter from home. And the people who left and never returned. There were no monuments along the ancient roads recording their names. The wind erased their footprints. But the road itself is the trace they left behind. And yet, if history ends with routes and trade volumes, we still have not really finished the journey. Because 2,000 years later, the things that pull us most powerfully back into the ancient world are often not magnificent palaces. They are an undelivered letter, a worn-out pair of shoes, a broken bowl, an IOU, a coin dropped on the ground. The enormous body of documents preserved at Dunhuang and across Central Asia lets us see the hesitation and messiness of ancient people writing in real life. A page may contain corrections, crossed-out words, or arithmetic mistakes. Real documents were never as neat as the pages displayed behind museum glass. Merchants made mistakes in their accounts. Letter writers complained. People borrowed money and failed to repay it. Someone hired camels and something went wrong on the road. It is precisely these imperfections that suddenly make ancient people feel close to us. More than 1,000 years ago, someone could get angry because a family member had not written back. Someone worried about prices. Someone worried that an employer would not pay. Someone feared that the next stretch of road was unsafe. Technology has changed. Human emotions have changed much less. That is why the Sogdian ancient letters are so moving. They are not heroic epics, yet they can feel more real than many stories about heroes. A woman abandoned far from home by her husband writes with anger, resentment, even despair. She does not write about the exchange of Eastern and Western civilizations. She writes, in effect, "Why have you abandoned us?" And because of that question, we suddenly understand what long-distance trade really meant. When a merchant left on a journey, he did not take only cargo away from home. He took part of family life with him. The people who stayed behind were pulled into the Silk Road too. So the number of people who truly participated in the Silk Roads was far greater than the number who physically traveled across the map. A weaver never left home, yet produced silk that traveled thousands of kilometers. A farmer never met a foreign merchant, yet grew tea or grain that was loaded onto a ship. A kiln worker never saw the Indian Ocean, yet fired a ceramic vessel that might one day sink near the coast of East Africa. A wife never left Dunhuang, yet through her husband's commercial network, her life became connected to Samarkand. History binds together people who never meet. Walk into the Mogao caves and the feeling changes again. There is no wind inside. The desert outside is bright, but the caves are dim. Ancient painters worked in that light from scaffolding, applying mineral pigments to the walls layer by layer. A large cave was not the work of one person over a few days. Some workers prepared the wall surface. Some drew outlines. Some applied color. Others modeled sculptures. The patron might have been a local official, a wealthy merchant, a family. Why would a merchant spend money on a cave temple? Faith mattered, of course, but long-distance travel itself could make people depend more heavily on faith. The road ahead was too uncertain. You did not know when a sandstorm would come, where bandits might be waiting, whether the mountain pass would close, whether you would ever return home. In a world where risk could never be fully controlled, people naturally look for protection beyond themselves. So donations from merchants and travelers to temples are not difficult to understand. For safety, for successful business, for the health of family members, for peace after death, those hopes are very close to our own. Religious sites along the Silk Roads, therefore, often receive support from merchants and travelers. Religion, in turn, gave travelers a spiritual network. People and belief helped one another extend the road. The murals at Mogao preserve scenes of travel and patronage, while the documents preserve the daily life of the city. Together, the caves are like a sealed container of time. When manuscripts from the library cave were rediscovered, many of the words on them had been sleeping for nearly 1,000 years. The paper was fragile. The ink remained. A sheet of paper might originally have been something a monk casually tucked away. Centuries later, it became evidence for an entire historical age. There's a strange irony in that. What ancient people considered important did not always survive. What they shoved into a corner sometimes did. The ruins of Lulan produce a similar feeling. The desert destroyed the city and preserved many of its remains. Wood, textiles, and writing can survive in an extremely dry environment. Houses collapsed. People left. Sand entered the streets. A living city does not become a ruin in a single cinematic moment. Perhaps the first thing to close was one shop, then an entire street. The wells became harder to use. Caravans began taking another route. Young people moved away. Fewer and fewer older residents remained. Then one day, the last family left too. After that, no one repaired the houses. The wind pushed doors open. Sand crept inside, little by little. Decades later, the road itself disappeared. Centuries later, no one remembered exactly where the city had stood. That is how a city truly dies. Quietly, slowly, with no audience. And when archaeologists find it again, the city returns in another form. It no longer sells goods. It provides memory. There are countless ruins like this along the Silk Roads. Naya, Daochang, Jiaohe, ancient Samarkand, fortresses and relay stations across Central Asia. Ancient cities of West Asia. Each one is like a lamp that went dark along the road. When we light it again today, the purpose is not to imagine the ancient world as perfect. It is to remember that people once lived there. At some sites, the most valuable material is not gold or silver. It is garbage. Garbage does not flatter anyone. A banquet mural may show only the lives of the wealthy. A rubbish heap contains the bones, seeds, broken pottery, and discarded tools of ordinary people. Archaeologists can use animal bones to reconstruct diets, plant remains to identify crops, ceramic origins to trace trade, and coins and writing to study connections. What an entire city actually ate can tell us more about its economy than the menu at an emperor's banquet. Archaeology has therefore gradually corrected many overly romantic ideas about the Silk Roads. Not every caravan had hundreds of camels. Not every merchant became rich. Not every city remained prosperous forever. Not every cultural exchange was peaceful, and not every technology can be traced to one clearly identifiable transmitter. Real history is messier than legend. It is also more interesting because real history leaves room for uncertainty. We can say, the evidence currently supports this interpretation more strongly. We can say, this story is famous, but later generations may have embellished it. We can say, we do not know what happened to this person. Not knowing does not make a story worthless. Sometimes uncertainty is the closest thing we have to real human life. What happened to the Sogdian woman who wrote that letter? We do not know. Did an anonymous merchant who left Chang'an ever make it home? We do not know. Why did a particular ship sink? Sometimes we do not know that either. Who owned a particular porcelain bowl? Of course we do not know, and that is precisely the point. Most people in history never left behind complete biographies. Think about our own lives. Without photographs, phones, or archives, how much would remain 2,000 years from now? Perhaps one receipt, a cup, a ring, a fragment of bone. So when we stand in front of an ancient worn-out shoe, we should not dismiss it as ordinary. It may be everything that remains of one person's life. Now the night is deep. Let us place the bolt of silk back at the beginning of our story one last time. It has just been lifted from the loom. Soft, bright. No one knows where it will go. The weaver is not thinking about Rome. Neither is the merchant in Chang'an who buys it. The man carrying it toward Dunhuang is thinking only about the next well. The merchant in Dunhuang cares about prices farther west. The guide in the Darim Basin watches the weather. The traveler crossing the Pamirs wants only to make it safely down the mountain. The merchant in Samarkand recalculates his margin. A Persian trader stores it with other goods in a warehouse. Eventually, a buyer somewhere in the Mediterranean world opens the bundle. A completely unfamiliar pair of hands touches the silk. Has the journey ended? No. Perhaps the silk is cut into clothing. Perhaps its patterns inspire local craftspeople. Someone wants to learn how it was woven. Someone tells another person what he has seen. The story keeps moving. The end point of one commodity can become the beginning of another cultural journey. That is why the Silk Road never truly ended. Roads can fall into disuse. Relay stations can collapse. Dynasties can disappear. But an exchange that has already happened cannot be undone. Once grapes have been planted and adopted, the decline of a trade route cannot turn them back into a foreign plant. Once an instrument has entered a musical tradition, a change in borders cannot make it leave. Once Buddhist scriptures have been translated, they cannot simply return to their original language. Once the use of paper has spread, the fall of one empire cannot make people forget it. Once one civilization has been changed by another, it can never completely return to what it was before. The Silk Road's real legacy then is not a road. It is a world that has been changed by contact with itself. If we stood outside the gates of Chang'an 2,000 years ago and watched a camel caravan depart for the west, we might think they were simply going on a business trip. They probably thought the same thing. No one would say, I'm going to change world history. I'm going to promote exchange between civilizations. I'm going to connect east and west. They would ask whether there was enough water, whether the cargo was tied down, how far they could travel that day. Yet those ordinary decisions, repeated for centuries, then for more than 1,000 years, changed Eurasia. The grandest events in human history are often not accomplished by people with grand intentions. They happen because ordinary people repeat small actions. Walk to the next city. Make one deal with a stranger. Learn one new word. Taste one unfamiliar food. Listen to one unfamiliar melody. Carry one story home. Then the next generation continues. If I had to choose one image by which to remember the Silk Road, I would not choose a map. A map is too quiet, and I would not choose only a piece of silk. Silk is too light. Remember a single night instead. A caravan has stopped in the desert. The heat of the day is fading. Camels kneel on the ground and rest. Someone warms bread beside the fire. People speak in low voices. One comes from the east, one from Central Asia. Perhaps another comes from somewhere farther west. Their accents are different. They worship different gods. Tomorrow, they may argue furiously over prices in the marketplace. But tonight, they all need the same fire. There are no city lights in the distance. The sky is brilliant. When they look up, they see the same stars. One of them may be thinking about home. Another is calculating profit. A third is worried about snow on the mountain pass. None of them knows that 2,000 years later, people will gather all the roads they traveled and call them the Silk Road. They certainly do not know that they will become part of the history of human civilization. The fire slowly burns lower. The wind stirs the bells. When the sun rises tomorrow, they will continue west. Another caravan is already coming from the west. The two groups will pass one another at some oasis. Someone will exchange goods. Someone will exchange news. Then they will separate again. That is all. Again and again. Generation after generation. From Chang'an to Dunhuang. From the Darien Basin across the Pamirs. From Samarkand to Persia and the Mediterranean. By sea from Guangzhou and Xuanzhou through Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and the Arabian Sea to West Asia and East Africa. Later, envoys, monks, and travelers crossed the continent in the Mongol era, and ocean-going sailing ships eventually tied the world's seas together. The routes kept changing. People kept moving. If this history must have a single answer, then the mystery at the beginning was never only who carried a bolt of silk to Rome. The deeper question is, in an age without trains, airplanes, or modern communications, how do human beings connect worlds separated by thousands of kilometers? The answer is not one emperor, not one war, not one people. The answer is countless strangers, each willing to travel as far as the next place they could reach. No one traveled the entire way. Together they did. That is the Silk Road. And that brings our story of the Silk Road to an end. I'm Jason from Eastern Historian. I'll see you in the next episode.